Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Stories to Watch from World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organisation working to improve people's lives, protect nature, and halt climate change. Every year at this time, we look at the big themes for the year and we work with our experts to tell those stories. We look forward to taking your questions in the chat throughout this event, and we will move to live Q&A immediately after the presentation. And now, over to our President and CEO, Dasgupta.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories to Watch 2025. My name is Dasgupta, President and CEO of World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization working to improve people's lives, protect nature, and halt climate change. Stories to Watch is something we do in the beginning of every year, sharing what we think will be the biggest ideas and events that will shape our world over the next 12 months. This year is the 10th anniversary of the historic Paris Agreement. In 2015, world leaders came together to avert the worst climate impacts, agreeing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Many saw this as a beacon of hope for the planet. 10 years later, we have mostly failed to implement that ambition. The 2024 Emission Gap Report finds we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 57% by 2035. This means cutting emission by 7.5% every year over the next decade. However, our carbon emissions, the main cause of climate change, continue to rise. The impacts are clear. 2024 was the world's warmest year on record, yet again. One of our stories from last year focused on the dangers of heat in cities, which kills thousands. Already in 2025, California experienced the costliest wildfires in US history, and Southern Africa continues to face one of the worst droughts in decades. Despite this, we believe today the Paris Agreement is even more critical than it was 10 years ago. The US leaving Paris will not stop climate impacts from hurting Americans, nor will it slow the economic transition already underway. But it will keep the US out of the only venue to influence climate decisions. Last year's Stories to Watch focused on election and why they matter. Politics reshapes international relations and outcomes. You can see our take on what actually happened in 2024 on WRI's social channels. Geopolitics greatly impacts how finance flows between countries. One of the biggest barriers to increasing climate ambition and delivering results on the ground is finance. International finance not flowing to the countries and communities that need it most. Last November in Baku, finance was the main topic of discussion at the COP29 climate negotiations. Delegates from across the world wrestled with questions of financing global climate action. How much money is needed? Who should pay? For the first time in 15 years, leaders came together to agree on a new climate finance goal to deliver at least $300 billion annually by 2035 to developing countries. The existing goal was $100 billion per year by 2020. In addition, they agreed that all actors should work together to mobilize $1.3 trillion per year for developing countries by 2035. There was mixed reaction to this negotiated outcome. Some countries thought it was ambitious, but most developing countries were disappointed. They thought donor countries did not do enough, and they were not clear how they would get the $1.3 trillion they actually need. Mobilizing this money and making it flow to developing countries is critical for the global transition. But first, where does this $1.3 trillion number come from? The UN asked a group of experts what the global financial need will be for the economic transition in the next 10 years. They projected that the entire world will require about $7.5 trillion per year by 2035. As you can imagine, this is an estimate. Many things can happen in the next decade. Out of the 7.5 trillion, 4.3 trillion of these climate finance needs will be in China and developed nations like US and EU. These countries are able to finance their own transitions. The remaining $3.2 trillion is needed in developing countries who have far fewer resources. The same report estimates that $1.9 trillion of the $3.2 trillion can come from public and private domestic resources in developing countries. This means developing countries need an additional $1.3 trillion from external funds to meet their transition goals. That's where the $1.3 trillion number comes from. Let's think for a minute what will happen if this money does not flow to developing countries. First, the most vulnerable people who have contributed least to climate change will continue to suffer the most. This unjust suffering will exponentially increase in the coming years. This is why finance is fundamentally about justice. Second, these countries will not decarbonize their economies at the speed and scale needed. As a result, the whole world will not decarbonize. So the finance from richer countries to developing countries is not just charity. It's an investment towards a safer world. This year is an incredibly important year for ambition. By COP30 in Brazil, all countries are supposed to come back with higher climate ambitions for 2035. Without certainty that adequate finance will be available, many developing countries will be reluctant to put forward ambitious plans. But if we find ways to ensure climate finance can flow, more countries can join the race to the top. Increasing finance and growing ambition is a virtuous cycle. We need to unlock both. That's why this year's Stories to Watch is about how to meet the $1.3 trillion per year goal. Before we get into numbers of billions and trillions, our first story is about what is the money for. First, we need to address the climate impacts that are already here and rapidly escalating, taking lives and impacting livelihoods. By 2030, vulnerable countries could face more than $500 billion in climate-related damages each year. Second, we also need to make sure the climate crisis doesn't get worse. Developing countries need to decarbonize their economies and find a path to low-carbon growth. And we should not forget the protection and enhancement of nature is a critical component of both building resilience and reducing emissions. We are experiencing increasing levels of climate devastation, from floods and droughts to wildfires and storms. Last year, terrible floods in Spain, Bangladesh, and Brazil displaced thousands and killed hundreds. Meanwhile, devastating droughts in Africa, Europe, and South America destroyed agriculture and pushed up global food prices. But even if climate impacts are happening everywhere, suffering is not evenly distributed. Low-income countries lack the resources to adequately deal with, let alone prepare for, climate disasters. And even for nations that may be reasonably well off, impacts can destroy a huge proportion of the economy. To get a better idea of the challenges they face, let's go to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where we have Courtney Bailey joining us.
Last year, Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 Atlantic hurricane on record, hit my country, devastating several southern Grenadine islands. In Union Island, 98% of homes and dwellings were destroyed, and the ground was stripped of trees. As I stand here speaking to you 6 months later, majority of the island is still without power. Hurricane Beryl almost completely destroyed several cash crops, such as bananas, avocados, and coconuts, leading to food shortages and loss of income for many farmers. Finance, to prepare for and build resilience of homes, critical infrastructure, local communities, and sensitive economic sectors to these extreme weather and slow onset events is critical, not just for sustainable development, but for survival in places like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. To recover, we utilize post-disaster loans, which means that more of our income goes to servicing debt. The weaker our economic situation, the harder it is to proactively invest in adaptation. That is why influential leaders such as Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, is calling not just for aid after hurricanes, but relief in servicing our debt and longer-term, lower-cost support to our government budgets to build resilience. Adaptation finance is a necessity for small island developing states. With it, we can protect our island, our environment, our livelihoods and economies from the impacts of climate change. The adaptation needs of these islands, like my home country, shows us why we need climate finance. And that's our story to watch for 2025.
That was Courtney Bailey, one of WRI's experts on adaptation finance. Most vulnerable countries need additional climate finance to build resilience and minimize future impacts. However, research shows that less than a fifth of adaptation finance even reaches local communities that need it most, even though these communities are best placed to decide how these funds should be used. Finance needs to flow to the right places sooner rather than later. In some places, climate impacts are so devastating that it is not possible to adapt anymore. When this happens, countries need financial support to get back on their feet. This is a separate piece of the puzzle called loss and damage funding. Of course, recovery is always better and less expensive when countries have prepared for a disaster. Finance for adaptation saves lives and livelihoods and makes economic sense. Look at Bangladesh. In 1970, Cyclone Bhola killed at least 300,000 people, even though it was only a Category 3 storm. The country responded by investing in resilience, from storm shelters to early warning systems. When Category 5 Cyclone Mocha hit in 2023, only 3 people were killed in Bangladesh. However, the world is a long way behind where it needs to be on adaptation finance. The target set during COP26 in Glasgow was $40 billion per year by 2025. We are actually on track to meet this target, but $40 billion is nowhere near enough. As you can see in the chart behind me, the estimated adaptation finance gap is up to $360 billion per year. We have established that countries need finance to build resilience to an already warming world. At the same time, the world needs to curb greenhouse gas emission at speed and scale to keep the problem from getting worse. Decarbonizing our energy system is important for stabilizing our climate. It also has many other benefits, like cleaning the air we breathe and improving energy security. But energy investment requires very different kinds of finance than adaptation investments. Today, emissions remain stubbornly high, and if trends continue, they will keep growing. Countries need to take steps across sectors, like energy, to bend the curve. Let's think for a minute where these emissions come from. As you can see, low and middle income countries make up to 70% of the emission. In particular, large developing countries contribute almost half of global emission. We don't just need places like US and EU to decarbonize. We need China, as well as countries like India, South Africa, Brazil to do the same. Thanks to falling cost and government investment, wind and solar power are being rapidly deployed around the world. But this is not happening at the same rate everywhere. Countries in Africa only attract around 3% of global energy investment, despite being home of 1/5 of global population and 60% of the world's best solar resources. South Africa stands out. The country has made clear commitments to decarbonize the energy system and has secured international climate finance to support it. Here's WRI's Katie Ross from the town of Komati to tell us more.
The enormous concrete cooling towers behind me are what remains of the Komati coal-fired power station. This was a coal-fired power station built in the 1960s, and for decades it's been a cornerstone of South Africa's energy system, taking in vast quantities of coal and producing electricity. Komati now faces a daunting challenge of phasing out of coal. South Africa has one of the world's largest coal reserves and is one of the world's largest coal producers. And like many countries around the world, is facing increasing pressure to decarbonize the energy system to tackle climate change. Millions of dollars in international support have been pledged to help Komati make that transition from coal to renewable energy, while supporting the workers and the communities around the power station. This is an excellent project, it's well conceived, but there have been tremendous challenges in its implementation. Firstly, there's been a significant gap between when the coal plant closed in late 2022 and when the renewable projects are expected to come online sometime in 2025. While many of the workers at Komati have found new opportunities at other power stations, the communities here in Komati have been left in the lurch. Many of the community members have not experienced the benefit of retraining programs or reskilling programs, and the economic diversification projects that have been promised are still in the pilot phases. There are so many lessons here at Komati. The first is around timing. You've got to be planning for new projects and new economic diversification opportunities as soon as the plant is planning to shut down. And the second is sequencing. These new projects need to be online well before the coal plant is shut down. And finally, it's about finance. The finance needs to be delivered swiftly, transparently, and impactfully to support better outcomes for people and the planet. Komati shows us the importance of climate finance, and this is our story to watch for 2025.
That was Katie Ross, Senior Director of Climate Action at WRI. Large developing countries like South Africa face huge pressures. They must reduce emissions while creating jobs and opportunities for their sizable population. The challenge is particularly acute in South Africa, where the unemployment rate for the last several years has remained stubbornly high, over 30%. South Africa is committed to net zero pathway, but they won't be able to transition at the pace necessary without external finance. In the long term, most of the money for investing in clean energy can come from private sector, as there are clear returns for these investments. But initially, public investment is necessary to create self-sustaining market. Some parts of the energy transition, like decommissioning coal-fired power plants or supporting retraining workers like in Komati, will still require much more concessional financing. South Africa is not the only place that needs finance for energy transition. The International Energy Agency estimates annual clean energy investments in developing countries needs to increase more than 7 times by 2030. These countries require transition financing not only to decarbonize the energy system, but also to invest in the broader decarbonization of the entire economy, including transportation, buildings, agriculture, and industry. And if we consider the need for climate adaptation, developing countries will need many different kinds of climate finance to support these diverse investments. So what should we watch for this year? First, the adaptation finance gap is increasing. At COP30 in Belem, will negotiators commit to at least double adaptation finance from $40 billion to $80 billion per year. Second, in 2023, countries made a historic agreement to establish a loss and damage fund. Last year, countries made a critical step in deciding that the fund would be hosted by the World Bank. This year, will the fund be ready to start disbursing financial support to countries? Third, countries will be updating their NDCs or climate plans this year. The deadline to submit is in February, but we expect many countries to release their plans as late as this fall, ahead of COP30 in November. Will we see meaningful ambition on both mitigation and adaptation, along with investment plans? From adaptation and loss and damage to mitigation, the various financing needs in developing countries will remain a critical area of focus in 2025 and beyond. Our second story is about where the money will come from. 1.3 trillion may seem like a very large amount of money, but let's put it in perspective. Our estimates show that the global GDP will be around $150 trillion in 2035. So 1.3 trillion will be less than 1% of global GDP. A more relevant comparison is how much we invest in infrastructure. The world invests approximately 10 to 15% of GDP on infrastructure every year. $1.3 trillion will be 1/10 of that in 2035. Now, let's go to Nairobi, where Melanie Robinson, WRI's Global Director of our Climate, Economics and Finance program, is joining us to help us understand how we can get to the $1.3 trillion. So Melanie, let's start from basics. What was in the $300 billion goal that countries agreed to in Baku last November?
Well, to understand the 300 billion, we need to go back to the previous goal of 100 billion, and 116 billion was finally delivered in 2022. That was made up of three parts. First, there was the bilateral part, so rich country governments giving to poorer countries, the multilateral part, multilateral development banks, multilateral climate funds, and thirdly, leveraged private finance. Now, the 300 billion has got the same three parts, but expanded, especially the MDB bit, and it does count money going from a broader set of countries.
Melanie, thanks. We just heard from Courtney and Katie that there are diverse needs for different kinds of investments. Will this $300 billion goal be able to meet that demand?
Well, we don't know exactly what mix of grants and loans and private finance is in that 300 billion goal, but there will certainly be a good amount which is in long-term loans and private finance, which is so important for funding investments that have a return, like renewables, especially in those richer developing countries. But it is so important that in this 300 billion, we have enough of that precious grant and highly concessional, cheap loan finance, because that's really important for adaptation, loss and damage, just transition funding to the poorest and most vulnerable countries in particular. And that's why it's so important that actually just before the agreement to the 300 billion, we found out that the fund that the World Bank has for the poorest and most vulnerable countries was replenished so that they have got 100 billion to spend over the next 3 years.
And do you think that debt burden, which is already a significant problem for over 50 countries, will become an even bigger issue?
Yeah, MDBs are a really amazing leveraging machine. For every $1 of taxpayers' money that goes in there, they can turn that into $4, even up to $10 in money provided to developing countries. And what they've managed to do over the last few years through some reforms is stretch that money even further. So a lot of the MDB growth has come from those reforms, from that stretching of the money that they already have. Now, debt is an issue, and an increasing number of developing countries are in debt distress. And that makes it particularly important that there's enough concessional finance, that loans are long-term and affordable, and ultimately that we find a more effective way to restructure and even relieve debt.
I think restructuring debt needs to again take center stage, but it hasn't been a big part of the conversation for a while. Let's assume for a minute that we will be able to get to $300 billion. That still doesn't even get us near what we need. Experts think that half of the $1.3 trillion needs to be public finance. What are the other ways we can increase public capital?
So there are three big ways that we can do it. The first is capital increases, the multilateral development banks, putting more money into the banks so they can really leverage that and provide more to developing countries. Second is innovative taxes. We can tax some of the polluting areas that are under taxed at the moment, like aviation, maritime, oil, and that could raise over 200 billion. And thirdly, we will need to look for other innovative sources because even that won't be enough.
Thank you, Melanie, for laying out how we can start building towards a $1.3 trillion goal. Let's look at what to watch for in 2025. First, will member countries consider more fundings to MDBs so they can increase their capacity to finance. Current political headwinds may make it difficult. But let's remember that the last capital increase was in 2018, when some of those same headwinds were also at play. Second, will international taxes gain traction as new sources of climate finance? For example, will the International Maritime Organization make progress on establishing levies on shipping? Countries including Kenya, Barbados, France, and Brazil have put together a task force to look at new ways to raise additional finance through international taxes or levies. Will there be broad acceptance of their proposal when they release it at COP30 in Belem? Third, the Finance for Development Conference will take place in Seville in June. This is a gathering of world leaders that takes place every 4 years to discuss the future of development finance. Will they make strides in reforming the global financial architecture? Will they bring climate, nature, and development finance together in a more coherent way? Fourth, just in the past week, the US has frozen almost all foreign assistance, including all climate finance. While there will be review over the next 90 days, we'll be watching to see how much of this finance is ultimately cut. A US retreat on development finance would have serious consequences. For the US, it could damage key geopolitical relationships, leave the country behind in important markets, and risk knock-on impacts on security and migration. For the world, this has widespread ramifications for people who rely on life-saving assistance from the US. It is still too early to tell what US cuts will mean for reaching the $300 billion and $1.3 trillion goals by 2035, but they may impact the pace of the scale-up. We must explore multiple avenues to ensure climate finance reaches $1.3 trillion by 2035. This means recognizing that climate finance is not a niche concern, but an integral part of the broader international development context and goals. In the best case scenario, public finance will only get us almost halfway to $1.3 trillion. So how do we get the remaining $700 billion? Experts suggest this will need to be filled with international private capital, which brings us to our next story. This story is about making private capital flow. Attracting international private capital for climate investment has been extremely difficult for developing countries. Investors believe that projects in these countries would be high-risk investments. It is still much more expensive to borrow money to invest in clean energy in most developing countries than it is in Europe or in the United States. For example, the same project in Germany will require 8% in equity returns compared to in Zambia, which will require 51% in returns. The World Bank and other development finance institutions have instruments that absorb some of the initial risks from projects by providing guarantees. But there's not enough public resources to de-risk $700 billion of private capital needed per year by 2035. Among developing countries, India is a critical outlier, having attracted significant private capital for clean energy investments in recent years. To help us understand what's going on there, let's go to Bengaluru and meet Pavan Mulukutla from WRI India.
Every country faces challenge in attracting climate finance. Here in India, we know public finance isn't enough to meet the climate finance needs of $100 billion each year. We also need private capital. And there has been a lot of hard work to create a more welcoming environment for private capital that is now paying dividend, meaning more money for new facilities such as the solar array of Kempegowda International Airport here in Bengaluru. First of all, the government is setting ambitious targets indicating to the private sector they are serious about making the switch and that India is a market worth investing in. They have set out clear goals and sectoral targets. India's National Electricity Plan aims at achieving 500 gigawatt of clean energy by 2030 and 600 by 2032. There is also a target for states to reach 43% share of renewable electricity by 2030. But they haven't just set goals. They also have a strategic roadmap for how they will support the shift towards clean energy through a series of nudges from India's policymakers. This provides investors with the predictable incentives that give them the confidence they need. The government has also signaled support for greening the economy through budgetary allocations and subsidies in both existing and new areas. This is also aimed at building investor confidence and building momentum alongside the national government's ratcheting up of ambition. When it works, it's not the government that has to put in the money. Instead, it makes it easier and more profitable for private capital to invest in India's transition. Third, government at both national and state level has made it clear that the transition to clean energy is all about competitive advantage, about building strong and prosperous economies for the future. Here in India, we are seeing progress in how a country can attract more private climate finance, but it needs to build upon its successes to bring the money needed. But the example of India shows us what can be done to make the engine of private climate finance work so much more effective, and that's a key part of our Story to Watch for 2025.
That was Pawan Mulukutla, WR India's Executive Director for Integrated Transportation, Clean Air, Hydrogen. Of course, India has advantages, including its growing economy, its deep pools of domestic private capital, and the size of its internal market. But there are few things that India did that all developing countries need to do to attract international private finance. As Pawan noted, India started by setting clear sectoral targets, which should be connected to each country's NDCs. Then, India put in place supportive national and state-level policies to nudge private sector. In addition, the government and the domestic banks introduced new instruments to enable sustainable financing to flow more freely and more efficiently. Critically, the government of India has significantly ramped up its investment of public capital in the sector. Between 2004 and 2014, the government spent less than $700 million. However, in 2024 alone, the government budget for the sector increased to $2.4 billion, growing the confidence of private investors. Most importantly, we see how some of the missing private finance in the $1.3 trillion needed can be mobilized with policies and targeted use of public capital. Public-private partnership will be the key to de-risk and attract sufficient private capital. We have seen effective examples of this holistic approach from China's Green Industrial Policy and the United States Inflation Reduction Act. While few countries will have this kind of firepower at their disposal, the lesson about setting clear ambition and backing it with strong public policy and public finance is relevant everywhere. For example, in 2019, the African Development Bank loaned funds to Morocco to support coordinated domestic climate policies. By 2021, this funding offered guarantees to nearly 50,000 medium and small enterprises, supported 1,100 projects led by women, and helped realize approximately $300 million in private equity investment. So, what should we watch for this year? First, keep an eye out for country platforms. These are country-driven initiatives to bring different pieces of public and private capital together behind priority investment. For example, Colombia just launched its country platform. We'll be watching how many new ones are launched, how the existing platforms get underway, and whether they enable countries to rapidly scale up private investment in climate action. Second, following the recent US election, 6 banks pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Will backlash against ESG initiatives slow climate investments? Or will net zero transition plans and increasing risk disclosures in Europe, Japan, and other countries continue to drive green investments? Third, Credit rating agencies have been criticized for overestimating the risk of investment in developing countries. Will leaders at the Finance for Development Conference agree to evaluate this risk differently? Fourth, the annual Finance in Common Summit in Cape Town will bring together 500 public development banks, representing $23 trillion in assets. As we saw in India, public development banks can act as a critical bridge for climate-related investment within countries. Will all banks embrace this as a central mission? With international private capital expected to fill half of the $1.3 trillion in climate finance needs by 2035, countries must work together to drastically scale up international flows. Our fourth story is about innovation. We can't predict exactly how much of the $1.3 trillion in financing will be generated through innovation, but we do know that we won't succeed without it. We need innovation in financial instruments across public and private capital. Financing nature is a very good example where vast financial innovation is needed. There is overwhelming evidence that biodiversity is very connected to climate outcomes. Nature is critical for mitigating climate change, sustaining biodiversity, cleaning our air and water, and helping us adapt to climate impacts. Some estimate 55% of global GDP depends on nature. For example, food, medical advances, and clean water all depend on high-functioning biodiversity. However, it has been very difficult to finance the protection of nature, and we're losing it quickly. According to the Global Forest Watch, tropical primary forest loss in 2023 was 3.7 million hectares, equivalent to losing 10 football fields per minute. The current economic incentive is to chop down forest and overfish the ocean. It is incredibly difficult to finance nature because we have failed to put an economic value on all the services ecosystems provide. Brazil has come up with one innovative initiative to scale up nature finance. Let's go to Sao Paulo, where Mirella Sandrini can tell us more.
How do you put a price on nature? The whole world needs to protect its forests, the oceans, and its habitats. But how do you make nature finance work? Here in Brazil, we know our tropical forests bring global benefits like absorbing carbon, preserving biodiversity, and regulating rain patterns. But they are also a local economic resources, and there is money to be made from extractive uses like logging, mining, or farming cleared land. The question is, how can the world pay so the forests here are protected, not exploited? One innovative idea here in Brazil might have found a way to meet the challenge: the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, or TFFF, aims at paying out the predictable annual figure of around $4 for every hectare of a preserved tropical forest, year after year. The idea, initiated by the Brazilian government and the World Bank, is that rich countries and philanthropies initially invested $25 billion. This then brings in a further $100 billion from private investors, making the biggest single pot of money aimed at fighting climate change and biodiversity loss. Once invested, this money would provide the returns for those predictable payments for intact tropical forest. There would also be a penalty of $400 for any hectare that is lost, all verified by satellite. The key things with the TFFF is that none of the money from rich countries, philanthropies, or private investors is donation. It would be returned after 20 years with interest slightly higher than government bonds. That makes this a new and innovative way to raise finance for nature. And it would make a real difference to protecting our forest. There is still a lot to do to get the 3FFF up and running. This is a vital year to see if the financing, the monitoring, and the governance can be sorted out in the run-up to the Belem COP30. And that's why this is part of WRI Stories to Watch for 2025.
That was Mirella Sandrini, who leads WRI Brazil. So there's a long way to go with TFFF. But if it does work, then it could change the way we're able to provide finance for forests. The key word is ambition, being able to mobilize enough money to make a difference and protect nature at the level we need. There won't be a silver bullet that solves nature finance. We need further innovations, better policies, standards, and regulations, as well as high-quality carbon and biodiversity markets. There's a place for innovations such as natural capital asset companies, land banks, as well as more traditional blended finance. So, what should we watch for this year? First, as Mirella said, there is a lot to make TFFF work. In 2025, we'll be watching for progress. Will the Brazilian government be able to assemble the finance to get it started? And will this draw in private capital? In addition, last October, world leaders met in Cali, Colombia, for the COP16 Biodiversity Conference to find ways to save and restore nature. But they walked away without a financial deal. Will leaders strike an ambitious nature finance deal when COP16 talks resume in Rome in February? In particular, we're watching to see how they bring together biodiversity and climate finance. Carbon markets have existed for some time, but they have yet to meet their full potential. When the voluntary carbon market was at all-time high of about $2 billion per year in 2021, many thought it would grow at least $10 billion by 2030. But the markets have fallen significantly, and such growth now seems unlikely. High integrity, high value carbon markets can still play an important role in financing nature. Will new integrity standards and increasing signals from government boost investor confidence in carbon markets? Will debt for nature swaps become a growing trend? Barbados recently used guarantees from MDBs to reduce its debt payments in return for conservation investments. Ecuador is using one of these to help conserve Galapagos National Park, committing to spend $18 million annually over 20 years. Will we see a more systemic approach to debt restructuring and relief to support nature and climate investment at scale? Finally, will there be reforms of subsidy regimes? More than $635 billion is spent on agriculture subsidy annually, placing immense pressure on natural ecosystems worldwide. As COP16's discussion resumes, countries are calling for the redirection of at least $500 billion in subsidies harmful to biodiversity. Denmark approved a new policy in 2024 aiming to better balance agriculture and nature. And the UK is starting to reconfigure agriculture subsidy to pay farmers for ecosystem services. Will other countries follow? It's not only imperative that climate and nature finance work together, but it's an opportunity to innovate our approach and find new pathways of financing nature. I hope you have enjoyed this journey through the intricacies of finance. The $1.3 trillion is possible to reach, but many things need to happen to make it flow by 2035. Some of it is already in play, including the $300 billion agreed at the last COP. Some of it is still in the idea stage, such as the maritime taxes and TFFF. Additional innovation also need to be developed. The biggest challenge will be mobilizing $700 billion in private capital. While developing countries can try to de-risk this capital with better policies and co-investments, richer countries also have to provide incentives to ensure private capital flows to these countries. This year will be an important year to start moving towards this goal. The 1.3 trillion will be catalytic for developing countries, equipping them with resources to finish the job themselves. Each part of the $1.3 trillion is connected. Like a pieces of a puzzle, one element of the 1.3 trillion can leverage and mobilize another piece. However, today, the different elements are governed by different regimes. That's why the biggest thing to watch in 2025 is how we'll bring all these pieces together. Efficiency, we need to draw on all sources of finance and make it work together as a system. And that requires the deep involvement of finance ministers and even heads of state from countries across the world. There are many things to watch over the next year. November will be a key month. At COP30 in Brazil, we need a deal that shows that the 1.3 trillion can be mobilized. And right on the heels of the COP, the G20 will meet. They're the world's biggest economies, countries that make up over 85% of global GDP and 75% of global emissions. The G20 is the only body that has the capacity and authority to connect the various pieces around finance. This year, will the G20 in South Africa make climate finance a long-term priority? And will the G20 help the world bring these pieces together as a system? So as we step into 2025, there is a growing recognition that our financial system must be reimagined to tackle climate change, protect nature, and improve people's lives. This transformation won't be easy, but you can see from today's presentation that there are many tools to get us there. By demanding bold steps from our leaders, leveraging limited resources to maximum impact, and harnessing innovation, we have the power to unlock financial flows to some of the world's most pressing challenges. Will we see the beginning of this transformation this year? Thank you for joining us for Stories to Watch 2025.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the WRI experts who participated in the presentation today. Now please join us for a live panel discussion led by Annie Dasgupta, joined by our experts from WRI offices around the world.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I want to make sure you can see me.
Does look like the camera might be unplugged. We switch to the internal.
All right, there we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for all of you for joining. And thank you very much for all the questions that you have put in the chat. I encourage you to continue to put in chat. I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion. I'm joined with some of our fantastic experts, WRI, here for this session. Let me just quickly introduce, and maybe you can wave. We have Melanie Robinson, who heads our Climate Economics and Finance team. We have Debbie Whale, who heads our US program. We have David Vasco, who heads our International Climate Initiative. We have Mirella Sandrini. Please wave so people know who you are. And Mirella, who heads our Brazil program. We have Rebecca Shirley, who leads our Africa program. We have Pavan from India, who leads many things, our transport, hydrogen, and air quality program in India. And finally, we have Katie Ross, who heads all kinds of things to do with, she's based in South Africa, and she leads a lot of her work in climate. So welcome to everyone. I'm going to jump into the questions. Let's just start with the question. Melanie, the first question is for you. As we are all expected, the Trump administration immediately pulled out of the Paris Agreement in the first days of the Trump administration. I think people want to know, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, great question. And of course, the US pulling out was expected, but it is a major blow. The US is a large emitter, and it has played a really important role globally on climate finance, technology, deal making. I think the first thing to say on the implication is that the main country that will be hurt by this is the US. It's losing a seat at the table where countries come together to hold each other to account and set the rules. And that will affect how hard the US is hit by the kind of climate disasters the US has seen in LA and the Appalachians just recently. And it could hand an advantage to China, Europe, and others in the green economy and jobs. But looking beyond the US, how much it will affect global cooperation and action really depends. Last time when the US pulled out of Paris, we saw other countries and even US cities and corporates really kept their foot on the pedal. And they were really clear that the Paris Agreement or the previous agreements matter, the UN process matters. This is a critical place where all countries can come together. Every single country has a voice, and they can really drive collective action in our collective interests. So let's see what happens. I think China, the EU, Brazil, many others are looking to step into that space. And I think we'll see climate action globally continue to push forward.
Thanks, Melanie. David, if I can just bring the other side of that, kind of the other side of the question, I'm rephrasing a question simply so everyone can hear it. David, so if large countries like United States, get out of Paris Agreement, what would it mean globally?
Well, I think as Melanie just said, we're likely to see a lot of the major, and I think all or virtually all of the major economies stay the course in terms of their participation in Paris. Certainly, the European Union has participation in Paris as a high priority. I think even with some political shifts in Europe, that'll be the case. China, as Melanie suggested, has very strong commercial interests in maintaining strong climate action around the world and bolstering it even further. So I think we have the EU and China as major anchors. Brazil certainly is showing this year their commitment. So we have a very strong set of major players. And in addition to that, many smaller countries that are highly vulnerable that see the Paris Agreement and global climate action is really essential to their interests. So I think we're going to see, on the whole, a staying of the course.
And David, that's what we saw last time the United States stepped out of the Paris Agreement, that not only countries stayed the course, but they kind of amplified the ambition. And it's actually now it's even more economically connected to what's happening in the world. So thank you, David.
Sorry, we also saw, I just wanted to add, we also saw some national governments step up last time, and I think we're seeing that again.
Right. Thank you, David. Mirella, if I can go next, as you can imagine, a lot of our audience and viewers are interested in what's going to happen in Brazil end of this year. We ourselves are very much looking forward to it. So the question, Mirella, is actually on nature-based solutions. What are the opportunities to advance nature-based solutions leading up to this COP, and specifically possibilities of carbon markets playing a more important role? Because in my talk, I mentioned how carbon markets have shrank over the last few years. Mirella, please.
Well, and with the COP30 taking place in Amazon this year, there's a unique opportunity to elevate nature-based climate solutions, NBS, and position the region at the center of a global climate action. Advancing NBS in the Amazon requires a holistic approach beyond the carbon credit marks. We should keep the focus on produce, protect, reduce, and restore framework. This means protecting and restoring ecosystems while increasing agricultural efficiency, reducing pressure on land-intensive commodities, and also fostering innovation, finance, and governance. A key opportunity is to highlight, for example, the assisted natural regeneration and agroforestry as scalable solutions for the Amazon restoration, which can enhance biodiversity, sequester carbon, provide sustainable livelihoods for local communities. COP30 also can draw global attention to the need for stronger public policies and financial mechanisms that support large-scale restoration efforts, for instance. Additionally, I may say that the urbanization in the Amazon grows. COP30 presents a platform to discuss how cities in the region can be better prepared to support the local population too, ensuring sustainability or sustainable development that aligns with environmental conservation too. About the voluntary carbon market, this can play a crucial role in the financial nature-based solution, of course, by channeling private sector investments toward projects that protect and restore natural ecosystem, contributing to the goals of the Paris Agreement. When implemented with a high environmental integrity, NBS carbon credits can provide essential funding for conservation efforts, while safeguarding biodiversity and support the rights and livelihoods of indigenous people in local communities. However, for these solutions to be effective, organizations must ensure that their use of NBS credits complements rather than replaces emissions reductions within their own operations and value chains, aligning with the 1.5 degrees mitigation pathway.
Thank you very much, Mirella. Mirella, you mentioned in your talk the importance of TFF that the Brazil is trying. It's good to hear from you. There are additional initiatives to add to the basket of solutions on nature solutions. I just wanted to add on the carbon markets. Carbon markets remain a very important instrument, and there are a lot of initiative across the globe right now, just like you said, to make them more credible, more usable, and have proper guardrails, as you just pointed out, for the market to grow. Thank you very much, Mirella. I might have to come back to the lot of question, and all of us are watching Brazil right now. Expect a lot of guests in this year. Thank you, Mirella. If I may, there are a lot of questions that you have asked about sectoral ramification of the climate agreement. So Debbie, if I could bring you in. Debbie has been working, not only she heads IUS, she's working on this topic of buildings and construction for a long time. Debbie, if you would just share with us how the construction industry and its growth, how does it impact climate? And also specifically, if you can illustrate, just because Mirella was just talking about nature, how that industry impacts or doesn't impact nature. Debbie, over to you.
Sure, absolutely. Addressing emissions and resource use in the construction sector requires both looking at the carbon and materials used in construction itself and the energy consumption of buildings once they're constructed. But also, if you sort of zoom out from there, how you build cities makes a huge difference, particularly in countries where urbanization is happening at a really rapid rate. So building cities that are dense, where buildings are located in places where people can easily move among home and work and recreation and nature, right? Having all of those in a place where people can move easily among them actually can have a huge impact on improving the emissions outlook and the natural resource impact. So in terms of the actual construction of buildings, transparency and data always are the first step. And then you can look at how to improve it. You can have national policies, model building codes, financial policies, as we've been talking about in these stories today. And then local policies and local implementation are really, really critical. So in terms of having, environmental product declarations for the materials you're using to construct buildings, all the way down to incentives and financing, engaging the firms and the companies that will be actually owning those buildings, operating those buildings. It's a whole ecosystem just in the construction sector itself. When it comes to nature and making sure also that we are not exploiting nature, I think that city construction and how you build cities in a dense way is super critical to build those next to each other, right, near each other, or in an integrated way, so that people can really be feeling that can have access to those natural spaces even in their day-to-day lives.
So not only the building itself, Debbie, as you're saying, but how we actually construct the planning or the neighborhoods and parts of cities actually have big impact on this. Debbie, thank you very much, and most probably we'll come back to you. If I can bring Pawan. Pawan is based in India, and you saw Pawan a little earlier. Pawan, there is a really interesting question we talked about adaptation and loss and damage and how communities are best placed to take decisions on these topics themselves, and how nations, local government communities need to work together for the best outcome to leverage the limited amount of finance there are. And I know, Pawan, a lot of this activities that is focused on community-led development is taking place in India. Could you share with you what you see happening and what you think could be happening more?
Yeah, thank you, Ani. I think a couple of thoughts around that, and also just jumping into some examples. I think there's this big partnership of the microgrid renewable project itself, which actually takes this to a community level. And this is exactly how the national targets and policies and ambitions that are being set are translating it to a state level, and that actually translated literally to community level. And this is actually being done to even empower people and livelihoods that we're talking about in rural areas. And I can also draw a similar example how it's being done in transport sector when we're talking about this transition. Is, for example, when you're talking about truck electrification or decarbonization of the whole transport sector, you're talking about engaging with drivers, you're talking about working in community with logistic service providers, and how do they actually even move these goods using this transition for the transport sector. So these two examples very clearly demonstrate in Indian conditions that you need to actually work for this transition to make it happen at the community level, at the state level, because there's no way that the national government by itself through its policies and just putting public finance will achieve this. I think again we see with different examples that the whole renewable energy implementation, also we're talking about these big farms, everything is happening when communities are involved. And I think one thing we need to do, remember that we're talking about transition, but livelihoods is part of this transition, which is extremely important in this whole, how do you create green jobs? And that's the way I would really say a model to engage local communities and build partnerships to really kind of see what works for them. And that really then helps in the transition. I think some of our work that our colleagues in the restoration team are also working in Madhya Pradesh, in central India, is also looking at around tomatoes, around some of these vegetables that we're talking about, and how communities are adapting to this livelihoods situations. I think that's how it will actually pan out. I don't see any other pathway unless we actually want to reach out to the very last person in the value chain.
Well, and I'm very, very pleased you brought the livelihood dimension to that. That not only it's just adaptation, but livelihood, that the restoration example, and how more cities, local governments, and states, in India's case, need to work with communities. Thank you very much, Pawan. I'm expecting, I don't know who else is connected, but we have a lot of students I'm expecting connected to this call right now. There's a very interesting question about capacity. So Rebecca, if I can call on you. The question is, how do we build long-term capacity, and what role does educational institutions play in that? And we have a phenomenal program in your city, in Nairobi, with the University of Nairobi, to do exactly that. But can you talk a little bit beyond the program? How does capacity and what the capacity needs are, or investment needs are in education to get our community and people, navigate the new economy that's facing us?
Absolutely, Annie. Thank you for that question from the audience. And I think exactly as Pavan just laid out, skills and capacity building to build the green workforce of the future is absolutely pivotal. One particular area of skills training that I want to highlight is the fact that every Ministry of Finance in Africa, and indeed across the global south, is actually now on the front lines of this climate mission. Their mandates are to mobilize the private sector resources domestically, bilaterally, internationally, that we've been talking about this entire Stories to Watch, and it is no small feat. That's why we built a program at WRI called RAM, Resilience Adaptation Mainstreaming Program, which was designed explicitly and without compromise to rally and support ministries. So every Ministry of Finance in the world does macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, budgeting, revenue projections, and so on. But how do you do this in a more climate sensitive, a more climate aware, a more climate innovative way? And how do climate considerations and risks really influence the futures that ministries of finance are planning for. Well, we've partnered with universities, as you mentioned, here in Kenya, where I'm calling in from, as well as Rwanda, Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Bangladesh, the Caribbean, to engage governments and deliver trainings through workshop and core curriculum delivery that help our ministries of finance now grapple with these issues of climate. And of course, that's not even to speak to what needs to happen at the tertiary and the vocational level to ensure that we have skilled populations now enter into a green workforce of the future.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And there's so many countries that are involved. I just would like to stay in Africa for a minute. Katie, if I can bring you back, because this question of skills is a very live issue in South Africa's own transition. Can you just add from South Africa perspective what Rebecca just talked about?
I mean, it's absolutely huge. If you think about the transition that lies ahead and the kind of policies we need to be getting in front of, the one is economic diversification, making sure we have enough opportunities for these new industries. The second is human resources development. So how do we get in place the right tertiary education, secondary education, and skilling programs to ensure that workers are matched with the private sector demand? And then finally, the other part, and importantly linked to climate finance, is the social support piece. So there's not going to be new opportunities for everyone to transition into. So it's making sure that grant finance and public finance is available to support those that aren't able to readily transition into the new economy.
Thank you, Katie. Katie, if I can stay with you for a minute.
Yes.
It was a really, I talked a lot about, and you did too, the importance of domestic public capital in this mix and how that is important to leverage capital. There's a really interesting question about the possibilities of domestic capital for co-financing and how do you see it? Maybe you can use the South Africa example that you know very well. Like, how does that work and what can we expect from it?
I mean, sure, the international financing aspect of this is absolutely crucial. But in South Africa, 90% of our transition needs are going to be met by local resources. That's public funding and private funding. And how we need to think about this is creating the bankable projects that private investors are very excited about, that they want to invest in, that they see good returns in. And then how do we use public money to help de-risk these investments, to help make their IRRs more attractive, and then importantly, fund the more tricky things that aren't so easily bankable, like climate justice, like community engagement, like community development initiatives. So these are very alive topics at the moment. They're being featured as prominently in South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership and also the Komati story that we had earlier today.
Thank you very much, Katie. It's connected to what Katie was talking about. There are a lot of questions on innovation, which I really like. I wonder, Melanie, if I could bring you back for a minute. About advancing, you talked about a need for innovation in your, when I asked you about what else could happen. The question specifically, innovation on South-South, do you see a lot of possibility of South-South cooperation? Melanie.
Yeah, well, there already is a lot of South-South climate finance, particularly from China. And a lot of people may miss that story because the 100 billion commitment didn't include that kind of finance. It was just focused on the developed countries, and that's where most people have had their eyes. But actually, WRI did a study to look at how much finance China's been providing for climate action. And shortly after, the Chinese brought out their own number, and they reckon about 3 billion a year has been provided. And they also made a commitment some years ago to stop coal financing as part of their shift towards doing much more on renewables. So that is really good news. I think what would be interesting is seeing more countries from the global south doing more. We've already seen Brazil and some of the Gulf countries, but there's clearly more that some of the richer developing countries, the higher emitting developing countries could and perhaps should do. And then I think also thinking about the quality of that finance. If you look at the Chinese finance, it's largely loans and not particularly concessional and sometimes tied to Chinese business. And thinking about making sure that the right kind of finance is going to the right kind of countries, and having some of those countries also play a bigger role in grant finance, in highly concessional finance would be interesting. I think the final thing I'd say is actually less about the money and more about South-South learning. And Katie was talking about some of the experiences they've had in South Africa with their transition. And what's really interesting now is we're starting to see developing countries coming together and learning from each other. How do you do this? What is the practice of a just transition? And actually even Global South with Global North, because there's no country in the world that yet knows really how to get their economy onto a different pathway. So as well as the money, I think that South-South learning, even South-North learning, is going to be really critical in the future years.
And we are seeing that, Melanie, just in our work between what's happening in, say, electrification of two-wheelers and three-wheelers and buses in India, and how that's being transferred to Kenya market, the learning between China and Brazil on agricultural commodities. So I think there's a lot of momentum for that, right? I mean, because as you said, I think every country is trying to figure out. No one actually knows exactly how to do this. So if I may bring Mirella, you back for a minute, just on this question on innovation. There's a question about TFF that you talked about, Mirella. And the question is, correct ones, is that, it's great, the TFF, but it still depends upon wealthy countries putting the initial money in to get it going, get the engine going. What's your expectation that will happen?
The TFF is a work in progress still, and its development acknowledges the complex finance engineering required to ensure that it delivers real benefits to tropical nations by minimizing financial risks. It's not so easy to find this formula, okay? The initiative is built with strong guardrails to prevent unintended consequence, ensuring that conservation fund is predictable, transparent, and sustainable, rather than relying solely on grants, which can be inconsistent and insufficient. The TFF provides low-cost financing to developed nations, granting them access to capital typically reserved for what are wealthier countries in general. Additionally, rigorous monitoring mechanisms, including satellite verification and financial penalties for deforestation, help guarantee accountability and ensure that funds are used effectively. What makes the TFF truly innovative is that it doesn't focus only on restoration or reforestation. It directly supports the standing forest, ensuring that conservation is as financially viable as deforestation. This marks a fundamental shift in the economics of land use, providing incentives for countries to keep forests intact while still generating economic opportunities. The TFF also recognizes that maintaining forests is not just an environmental commitment, but an investment in long-term climate stability, biodiversity, and sustainable development. As this mechanism continues to evolve, efforts will may focus on fine-tuning financial structures and governance framework to ensure that it remains equitable, scalable, and effective in protecting the world's most vital tropical forest. My 2 cents here is that this complex and very innovative financing engineer can bring positive and completely new answers to how to keep this fund for such a long time. Or forever, as the name says, forever.
Forever. And no, I think the point you made about changing the incentive, which is the core of this fund, is to reward people for standing forest and penalize people 100 times, I think. I think that's the current plan for destroying forests. And then in reversing that, because right now, the incentives are all towards destroying forests and creating it pasture land or agricultural land. So if the core incentive doesn't change, it will be very hard. I mean, last year we saw 10% of tropical forest being destroyed. Our own data show that. So this is much needed. So we wish all the success to the TFF and other funds. Thank you so much, Mirella. David, if I could have you back, there's a broader question. Maybe I should have asked that question first, David. There's a broader question is about, are we making enough progress on the Paris Agreement? And maybe, Pavan, I'll bring you back on country specific, but let David go first. What's our assessment?
Yes, well, it's clear that the world is moving, but not yet making adequate progress or fast enough progress. So that's very clear when we look at what projected temperature changes. But we also have to keep in mind we are seeing booms in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, and batteries. So that's the broader context. In terms of the Paris Agreement itself, I think it's important not to place too much burden on the shoulders of Paris. The question isn't so much whether it's succeeding or failing, but whether countries are failing Paris and the Paris framework and its objectives. And Paris puts in place a really robust framework for motivating countries to come together, work together, and also raise their sights on a regular basis, as well as reporting and tracking what progress is happening. Then the question comes down to what's happening on the ground, in fact, what national and subnational policies are being put in place. We certainly have to work to make Paris as effective as possible, really focus on its core objectives and roles. So that includes increasing ambition over time, finance frameworks, transparency and reporting. But we also have to look at some of the other ways in which countries are working together, cooperative initiatives on things from energy to forests, ways subnational governments are working together, build a real ecosystem, if you will, of international cooperation to move things forward. And then ultimately, as I was saying, things do come back to what's happening on the ground. It has to happen at the national and subnational level.
I'll go to on the ground in a minute, David, but there's so much news about how this is not working, that is not working. In my presentation, I talked about how the temperatures are rising. This is 10 years since Paris, right? And when we met in Paris, the world was going towards a 4-degree world. And the Paris Agreement was to bring the world to a 1.5-degree world by end of the century. Have we made any progress in the last 10 years?
Well, as you're saying, we've over time continued to push downward the temperature projections. So I do think we're making progress. I think that when you look back at Paris, there was talk of renewable energy, but electric vehicles, just to take one example, were not on anyone's radar, hardly discussed in Paris. And so I think we've seen many of the underlying dynamics shift. That said, we obviously have to do much more. We have to, as we've discussed today, work to make sure that the financing is available for so many of the changes that need to happen. So progress is happening. The question is how to really make the step changes that we need and how to use international cooperation to make that possible without being too Pollyanna about any of this. It's not an easy challenge.
It is not, but we are making progress. But I like what you said about how in Paris, we did not know the progress we will make in 10 years in jobs and opportunities for the sizable population. The challenge is particularly acute in South Africa, with an unemployment rate. I don't know what's happening, but I want to continue. Stubbornly high, over 30%. I was going to say that the innovation that needs to take place in technology, that is actually last year, countries in a critical step deciding. Someone needs to stop something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Someone was. Pavan, if I can just go back to you, the question David teed up for you is that where are we in a specific country? Because it doesn't matter what a country is doing or what a country context is. These are very country-specific transitions. How is India doing in its commitments? Pavan?
Yeah, and I would say India actually is ahead of the curve in achieving its 2030 targets. And in fact, actually the NDCs were updated. The key difference between India's old and new NDC targets is that the updated NDC significantly increases the goal for reducing emissions intensity of its GDP. So earlier it was 33 to 35% reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, to actually 45% reduction. So I think we have increased the bar there, while also raising the target for non-fossil fuel-based electricity generation capacity from 40% to 50% by 2030. In fact, the earlier targets were met by 2023, and hence it was revised. One thing I do want to point out is, however, a far more ambitious target, and the financing need for that is going to be challenging, because India's annual climate finance needs for net zero ambition by 2070 is cumulatively about 1 trillion USD by 2030. Currently, we're talking about only 45 USD billion per annum, and most of it is actually 80%, I would say, is domestic. So I think the climate finance is going to be a big challenge that needs to be addressed for this ambitious NDC target that we're talking about by 2030.
And though, I mean, in your part of the presentation, you did talk about how India is attracting more than other countries in the same income level, private capital. India keeps talking about the gap of private capital there is. So thank you, Pawan. I think just so that we talked about the international, we talked about national, let's drill down further one more step. And Rebecca, if I could bring you, there's a very good question about rural livelihood and rural communities, how they can participate in this live movement, and what is their, not only participation, what does it mean for their livelihood? And we have such great examples in the regions you're working in, Rebecca, if I could. Rebecca, please.
Definitely, Annie. I think you already mentioned that even 55% of global GDP depends on nature. That percentage is far, far higher in the context of Africa and many other global south regions. In Africa, over 65% of GDP is delivered through agriculture, for instance, and most of that is delivered through smallholder farmers working on 2 hectares of land or less. In some countries, we're talking about even 0.4 hectares of land. So all of that to say that there's definitely a place for indigenous communities and local communities in climate solutions. If you think of 3 sectors, 3 nature-based sectors, circularizing the food economy or transforming the food systems economy, restoring degraded landscapes, and protecting what remains of standing forests. Those are 3 sectors that are primed and geared towards indigenous leadership. And in fact, there's already a lot of activity happening in these spaces. The question is, how do you turn this into legitimate, robust sectors of economy that can deliver waves, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dignified, meaningful jobs that are future-proofed for the climate? And I think we do a lot of work in trying to answer that question. For us, it's a lot about policy engagement. How do governments engage indigenous communities and their representation in designing projects and incentive schemes for nature-based sectors? And there's so many actors here in Kenya. You can think about the Green Belt movement in Rwanda, the circular food economy movement in Congo Basin, Repeliac, a movement of indigenous communities focused on forest management or indigenous forest management that can be engaged in policy development. It's also about technical and financial support and how you direct that down to the level of indigenous communities, local communities. And then third, of course, I would be remiss not to talk about data and how we actually build public access data systems that can be used to verify and track activity that's happening at the small scale, but is aggregating in some way. So these are sort of the areas that we need to see more work in, and where we need to see more coordination from national to international. You mentioned those different actors, but there are many sectors, especially the nature-based sectors, which are primed for indigenous and local community leadership.
And Rebecca, that is why, our work, I just want to share with our listeners here. That's why, we end up talking a lot about energy system when we talk about climate. But as you just pointed out, the food system, this is why WRI focus on food system, is not only 1/3 of emission in the countries we work in, half the population is connected to that sector. And it is one of the biggest, if not the most important driver for nature destruction. So these is a connected thing that not only is directly connected to this, but connected to people and their livelihood in all our work to Africa. So thank you for bringing that perspective, Rebecca. So we have about 5 minutes left. So if you have a burning question, please write it down so I can ask them. Melanie, if I could go to you, just reversing from rural communities to private financial institutions. In our talk, we both talked about the importance of private capital. I said $700 billion of private capital is needed, and private financial institutions, not just investors, people who manage these things, have to play a very important role in this. Yet, in the recent years, we have seen one after another big banks are walking away from different kind of, net zero association, different the United States, the 6 big banks, others. What does this mean for us, for that goal?
Yeah, thanks, Annie. And they do play a really important role, as you just reminded us. Half that 1.3 trillion is supposed to be private finance, and around half of that half is meant to be mobilized by public finance. The other part is pure private finance, investing in developing countries in green investments, because that's what they want to do, because that's what makes commercial sense. And the financial institutions are right at the top of the pyramid. They make the decisions that fund the corporates, fund the investments. So what happens with them really, really matters. And you ended there with the negative, but I want to start with the positive, which is we are seeing lots of financial institutions over the last decade increasingly realize that it is in their commercial interests to think about the green economy, to worry about the climate risks that they've got on their portfolio, to worry about stranded assets, and to take the opportunity of the green economy. And that's why we have seen lots of funds signing up to things like GAFANs and net zero commitments. And we particularly see that with insurance and pension funds, because they have to take such a long-term view that it really makes sense for them to worry about and think about the problems and the opportunities in the future. And I should say that's been reinforced by regulation and disclosure requirements, which is making banks have to think this way. But you are right that we've seen two things. One, some financial institutions draw back from their commitments, sometimes as they realize they are harder to meet than they had hoped, and that technology hasn't moved as fast, or policy or regulation has not moved as fast as they would have hoped. And partly, the political context of the ESG backlash. And so what I would say about that is, I don't think we should be too distracted by some of the big headline grabbing news about those who have withdrawn, because actually we are still seeing more and more institutions joining, and that is the direction of travel. But I think it also reminds us that voluntary commitments and sustainability strategies, they will only get you so far, and that really it's got to make sense to the core business strategy of a financial institution for them to invest green. And for that to work, the economic system has to shift. And here I'll just give one example of subsidies. All the while that the majority of global subsidies are going into fossil fuels and into harmful agricultural practices, it makes economic sense to invest in that direction. But if the movement to shift from harmful subsidies to greener subsidies were to happen, that would actually shift the economics straight away to companies investing in those greener sectors. And that could be reinforced by some of the trade measures, which are then incentivizing, you can get access to the EU market if you can produce green steel. So it's the straight economics that in the end is going to drive the real change in financial institutions. And I think we have to turn our minds to that.
Thanks a lot, Melanie. And I also see from the same institutions, their public posturing and what they're actually doing. And they all are, say they continue to do so it's a complicated moment, but I do think the trend. We're almost out of time, but I'm dying to ask one question, and Debbie, you have to promise to answer it very, very briefly, because it's a really good question about what I can do. So let me ask that, but if I can ask all our experts to try to answer as many questions as you can online. Debbie, the question is from I'm guessing a US resident, who's asking, if my state, it doesn't have a climate plan, I don't know what's going on, what can I do in that case? So please, Debbie, it's a great question to end with.
Yeah, thanks, Ani. That is a great, really important question. The great news is there's incredibly strong evidence that economic growth and climate action go hand in hand. And that means that, WR research demonstrates that when you pursue ambitious climate action, you deliver economic growth, good jobs, poverty reduction, health benefits, meaning that climate action is a huge growth opportunity in the 21st century. And that means also that in states in the United States and elsewhere that don't have emissions targets, there are a lot of other goals that we can work towards where climate action can come in and be a really critical piece of the puzzle, and where you can move forward on climate action even with that not being sort of the primary target. That's critical. That's critical for actually making change and building coalitions, and particularly in the United States, the city and community level we've seen is really, really important, right? We talk about something called multi-level governance, which sounds really big and broad, but essentially it's just saying national and state and local level governments all have a place at the table, and they all have a role to play. So working with your local government, I live in Washington, D.C., we have neighborhood advisory neighborhood commissions, right? Where it's just a couple of blocks and you can actually make change in your ANC. You can make change in your community, in your city.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Now we are actually a little over time. I really want to thank all of you for joining us. WRI won't be WRI without the broad partnership we have with all of you, your interest in the topic. All this will be in our website in different languages and resources that Debbie talked about and all of our experts talked about. So I encourage you to keep engaged through our website and to contact us directly. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for being here. Goodbye.